You know that slightly weird feeling you might get looking at, say, a honeycomb,
Hmm.
or maybe even just the bubbles clustered together in your coffee?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, for some people, that feeling isn't slight at all. It can be, well, surprisingly intense,
Yeah.
even looking at something totally normal like a strawberry.
Right, and what you're describing there, that sounds a lot like trypophobia. It's this really strong aversion people can have to seeing repetitive patterns or clusters of small holes or bumps.
Trypophobia.
Yeah,
Huh.
and there's this idea that maybe our brains are sort of hardwired to see those patterns as a sign of danger. Like maybe it's an evolutionary leftover from needing to avoid venomous creatures or something.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. And if hearing that makes you go, ooh, yes, that's me.
Or maybe if you're just curious, well, you're in the right place.
Hmm.
Today on the deep dive, we're going to jump into the world of trypophobia. It's surprisingly complex, actually. We want to figure out what it's all about.
Yeah, what the science says. And it's still, you know, a bit of a puzzle. Exactly. Why can these seemingly harmless patterns trigger such, well, such strong reactions in some of us?
And for this deep dive, we've looked at scientific studies, obviously, some reviews of the research, but also what people are saying online in forums and communities.
Oh, good.
And we'll even touch on a couple of times it's kind of popped up in pop culture, too.
Right. So our goal today is really to unpack the main insights, understand the current scientific thinking, what the best guesses are really, and just explore why a simple cluster of holes can be so unsettling for some people.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's get into it. So first things first, what exactly is trypophobia? Can you define it a bit more?
Sure. So fundamentally, it's that strong feeling, usually aversion or disgust, when you see those repetitive patterns, clusters of holes, bumps, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note, while it can be really upsetting for people who have it, it's not technically recognized as its own separate mental disorder in the DSM-5.
DSM-5, that's the big diagnostic manual, right?
Exactly, the standard guide for mental health professionals. But, and this is key, if the fear or the distress it causes is really excessive, persistent, and causes significant problems, it can be diagnosed as a specific phobia under that category.
Gotcha. So even without its own label, it's acknowledged as a real issue if it's severe enough. You mentioned fear and disgust.
Hmm.
Is it usually one or the other?
That's a really interesting point. Although the name has phobia in it, which implies fear,
Right.
most people who experience trypophobia actually report that disgust is the primary emotion they feel when they see these images.
Disgust, okay.
Yeah. Now, some people do feel a mix, both fear and disgust. But whatever the main feeling is, it often comes with a physical reaction, too, like that involuntary cringe.
Oh yeah, the skin crawling thing.
Exactly. That's often the autonomic nervous system reacting.
Wow. It really sounds like a gut reaction, almost primal. What kind of things typically trigger it?
The triggers can be pretty varied. Things like lotus seed pods are a classic
Oh,
example.
I can picture those, yeah.
Certain fruits, the patterns in soup bubbles, or even coffee bubbles, like you mentioned. Also, holes made by insects, or sometimes images of wounds or diseased tissue.
Okay, stop there, that last one.
Ah!
Yeah, that definitely makes my skin prickle, just hearing about it.
Right, like those images of mango worm infestations in animals, they're often cited as very strong triggers.
Ugh. Okay, so what about the symptoms people actually feel? It sounds like it's more than just feeling a bit grossed out.
Oh, absolutely. People report things like getting goosebumps, feeling shaky, or having that distinct cringing sensation. Some even report physical symptoms like nosebleeds, though that seems less common.
Nosebleeds.
Yeah. And then there's the emotional discomfort, obviously, but also visual discomfort, things like eye strain, seeing distortions or illusions when looking at the patterns. It can be quite intense.
Definitely sounds intense, which naturally leads to the question, why? What's actually happening?
Right. What's causing this?
Yeah, let's dig into the theories. I know you said the science is still kind of limited, but what are the main ideas floating around?
Okay, so one of the leading theories comes from researchers Jeff Cole and Arnold Wilkins. They propose this idea of biological revulsion.
Biological revulsion.
Yeah. The idea is that it's not really a learned fear, but more like an automatic unconscious reflex. They suggest these specific shapes, the clusters, the holes, might be inherently linked in our brains to things like danger or disease.
So like an evolutionary hangover.
Sort of, yeah. Potentially, it goes back to our ancestors, those who were instinctively wary of patterns that might resemble, say, venomous animals.
Like snakeskin or certain insects?
Exactly. Or maybe even dangerous organisms. If you had an innate aversion, you'd avoid them, and you'd be more likely to survive and pass on that trait. It's that classic evolutionary argument.
Okay, I can see the logic there. Avoid the spotty snake, live longer.
Pretty much. They also mentioned the pipa pipa frog as an example. It carries its young in these holes on its back, and images of it are known triggers.
Ah, okay, so the brain sees the pattern and just screams danger,
Yeah.
basically.
That's the core idea. But, like with many things in science, there are counter-arguments or nuances.
Of course.
Some researchers, like Can and colleagues, have argued that the direct link between trypophobia and specific deadly creatures might be a bit weaker than suggested.
How so?
Well, they point out that maybe this aversion, if it is linked to danger, might develop later in life rather than being purely innate, something we're born with. So maybe not a direct hardwired snake response.
Okay. So the evolutionary angle is plausible, but maybe not the complete picture, or maybe it works differently than just avoid pattern predators.
Right. It's likely more complex. And that brings us to another aspect, the actual visual characteristics of the images themselves.
You mean what the patterns look like specifically?
Exactly. Researchers, including Martinez Aguayo and Cole and Wilkins, again, have looked at the sort of mathematical properties of these images.
Okay, getting technical now.
A little, but it's interesting. They found these triggering images often have high contrast energy concentrated in the low and mid-range spatial frequencies.
Spatial frequencies, like how close together the details are.
Yeah, basically. Think of it like visual texture. These patterns aren't super fine, like tiny dots everywhere, nor are they very large spaced out elements. They're in that middle ground, distinct shapes repeating with clear edges.
So like not just any holes, but holes arranged in a particular way with strong contrast.
Precisely. It seems to be that specific kind of visual noise or rhythm that has the greatest energy at those mid-range frequencies that really gets to people.
Fascinating. So it's the pattern's visual signature, almost. Now, you mentioned another theory earlier, too, something about disease.
Yes, that's another compelling line of thought. From researchers like Kupfer and Ley, and also Yamada and Sasaki, the hypothesis here is that trypophobic reactions might be an overgeneralized response.
Overgeneralized.
Yeah, an overgeneralized aversion to stimuli that happen to resemble things like parasites or infectious skin diseases.
Okay. That connects back to the mango worms example, or maybe just seeing clusters of spots on skin.
Exactly. It taps into that intuitive feeling of that looks unhealthy or that looks infectious.
Right.
And there was a key study by Kupfer and Love. They showed images to people with and without trypophobia. Some images clearly depicted diseases, others were just neutral cluster patterns, like the lotus pod.
Okay. And what do they find?
Well, everyone showed an aversion to the actual disease images, which makes sense.
Sure.
But, and this is the crucial part, only the group with trypophobia showed a strong aversion to the disease-irrelevant cluster images as well.
So their reaction was broader.
Exactly. It suggests that trypophobia might be this kind of hypersensitive, maybe even misplaced reaction where the brain sees any cluster pattern and flags it as a potential parasitic or infectious threat, even when it's totally harmless.
Like the brain's infection alarm is just set way too high.
That's a good way to put it. It's an oversensitive threat detection system for that specific visual cue.
That really makes a lot of sense, actually. Now, I also read somewhere about potential links between trypophobia and other conditions, like OCD.
Yes, that's another area researchers have explored. Some studies have found a significant association or comorbidity between trypophobia and obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Interesting. So a fair number of people with trypophobia also have OCD symptoms.
It seems that way. A significant minority, yes. Which suggests there might be some shared underlying psychological mechanisms, maybe related to anxiety, disgust, sensitivity, or repetitive thoughts.
Are there links to other conditions too?
Yeah, some research has also noted connections with things like major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. These conditions often occur together, so it's complex to untangle.
True.
However, it's worth mentioning, at least one study by Les and colleagues suggested that general anxiety on its own might not necessarily cause trypophobia.
So anxiety might be present alongside it, but maybe not the root cause.
Possibly. Or the relationship is just more complicated than we currently understand. We definitely need more research to clarify these links.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. I'm really curious about the social side, the cultural aspect. It feels like something that really blew up online.
Oh, massively. The internet is central to the trypophobia story. In fact, the name itself, trypophobia, is thought to have been coined online.
Really? Not by scientists.
Apparently not initially. The story goes it was created around 2005 by an anonymous user in an online forum. It's just derived from Greek, trypa for hole, and phobos for fear.
Wow. So it literally emerged from the community experiencing it.
Pretty much. And since then, it's become a thing on social media. There are dedicated groups, forums, subreddits where people share images that trigger them, talk about their reaction.
Must be validating for people finding others who get it.
Absolutely. Because it isn't or wasn't widely known in the mainstream, finding these online communities probably helped a lot of people feel less alone, less like their reaction was just weird or inexplicable.
Yeah, I can imagine. But the internet being the internet, I bet there's a downside too.
You bet. There's definitely the issue of people intentionally posting triggering images, sometimes manipulating photos to add holes onto skin, specifically to provoke a reaction.
Ugh, that's horrible. Why would people do that?
It's hard to say for sure. Trolling, maybe? But Cole and Wilkins did note that disgust seems to intensify when the clusters are shown on human skin.
That makes intuitive sense. More threatening, maybe?
Perhaps. And Jennifer Abbasi, writing about this, suggested there might even be a kind of emotional contagion happening in these online groups.
Emotional contagion.
Yeah.
Like seeing other people react strongly makes your own reaction stronger.
Yeah, potentially.
Hmm.
This shared focus and validation might inadvertently amplify the negative feelings associated with the images.
That's a tricky dynamic. I also remember it hitting the mainstream news a few years back because of a TV show, right?
Yes, that was in 2017 with American Horror Story. One season featured a character with trypophobia, and they actually used triggering imagery in the promotional materials, the ads.
Oh, wow. I remember that now. It caused quite a stir.
It really did. A lot of people were understandably upset, criticizing the network for using potentially distressing images so blatantly. They felt it was insensitive, even exploitative.
Yeah, I can see that.
But on the other hand, some argued that maybe, just maybe, this raised awareness. It got people talking about trypophobia, perhaps wanting to more understanding or even spurring some research interest. It's a double-edged sword.
Definitely. And wasn't there something more recently with a phone design?
Ah, yes, the iPhone 11 Pro. When it came out with those 3 camera lenses clustered together on the back.
That's the one.
Yeah, quite a few people reported that the design triggered their trypophobia. It's a fascinating, real-world example of how these patterns can show up in unexpected places.
It really is. It makes you wonder just how common this aversion is, even if it's not at a clinical level for most people.
That leads perfectly into the question of prevalence. How many people actually have this?
Right. Do we know?
We don't have exact figures for diagnosed trypophobia, partly because it's not an official diagnosis on its own, but research suggests that an aversion to trypophobic imagery is actually relatively common.
More common than you might think.
Possibly. That 2013 study we mentioned earlier, the one by Cole and Wilkins, they found that around 16%, so about 1 in 6 of their participants, reported feeling discomfort or repulsion when looking at the lotus seed pod image.
16%. That's quite a lot.
It is. And interestingly, even the participants who didn't identify as having trypophobia still rated the trypophobic images as more uncomfortable to look at compared to neutral images.
So maybe it's more of a spectrum. Some people are just a bit bothered. Others have a full-blown reaction.
That seems very likely. It suggests a widespread, maybe low-level sensitivity to these kinds of patterns exists in the general population.
And is there any difference between groups? Like men versus women?
Yes, the current research indicates that trypophobia appears to be more prevalent in women than in men.
Okay, another piece to the puzzle. Now, for someone who finds this is really impacting their life, what about treatment? Is there anything that helps?
Currently, there aren't any treatments developed specifically for trypophobia because, again, it's not a distinct diagnosis in the manuals.
Right.
However, drawing from treatments for other specific phobias, the most likely effective approach would be exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy.
Yeah,
That's where you gradually face the thing you're afraid of.
exactly. In a controlled, safe way, a therapist would help the person gradually encounter trypophobic images or stimuli, starting with less intense ones and working their way up, learning to manage the anxiety and disgust response over time. It helps desensitize the person.
Okay, that makes sense. Standard practice for many phobias. So let's try to wrap this up. What are the main takeaways from our deep dive today?
Well, I think the first thing is that trypophobia, whether it's intense disgust or fear, is a very real experience for a significant number of people, triggered by these specific cluster patterns.
Right, it's not just in their head.
Definitely not. And while the exact cause is still debated, we have these intriguing theories: the evolutionary biological revulsion idea, the link to avoiding venomous things.
And the overgeneralized disease avoidance hypothesis.
Exactly. Plus, the specific visual characteristics of the triggers, that mid-range spatial frequency thing, seem really important.
And we learned it's not officially a disorder in the DSM-5, but can be diagnosed as a specific phobia if it causes major distress or impairment.
Correct. And we can't overlook the role of the internet and online communities in bringing awareness, providing validation, but also potentially amplifying the reaction sometimes.
Yeah, and the media's role too, like with American Horror Story or the iPhone design, bringing it into wider conversation, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about that study where even people without trypophobia felt some discomfort, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
What do you think?
Well, if aversion to these patterns is actually quite common, even at a low level, what other maybe subtle visual cues out there might be influencing our emotions, our behaviors, in ways we just don't consciously recognize?
Hmm.
Perhaps what bothers us on the surface, like these holes, is just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe it hints at a much deeper story about how our senses, our evolutionary history, and our perception of threat are all intertwined.
That's a really fascinating thought to end on. Maybe the visual world is constantly nudging our emotions in ways we haven't even begun to understand yet, something to definitely keep in mind.